December 22nd, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. The Belgian town of Bastogne, encircled, besieged, slowly freezing to death. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard stood in the snow-covered command post courtyard, watching for German officers approach through the devastated landscape under a white flag of truce. Their boots crunched through ice-crusted snow. Behind them, the forest stood silent, bare trees like skeletal fingers reaching toward a gray sky that promised more snow, more cold, more death. These four men carried with them a typed ultimatum, a document that dripped with the confidence of victors who believed they had already won, who thought the outcome was merely a formality awaiting American acknowledgement. The message they delivered would become one of the most famous documents in military history, not for what it demanded, but for the response it received. "The fortune of war is changing," the German ultimatum read. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne had been encircled by strong German armored units. There was only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The German officers waited in the cold, supremely confident in their position, in their numerical superiority, in the inevitability of American capitulation. They had every reason for confidence. Approximately 18,000 American soldiers were trapped inside a shrinking perimeter, surrounded by 30,000 German troops, supported by hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. No supplies could reach the defenders. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft for a week. The nearest relief forces were more than 100 miles away, fighting through their own desperate battles. By every calculation of military science, by every precedent of modern warfare, Bastogne should have fallen days ago. What those German officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that 130 miles to the south, General Georges St. Patton had just made a promise so audacious that even Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower thought he was either joking or delusional. A promise that would require moving an entire army, 250,000 men and more than 130,000 vehicles, through impossible winter conditions faster than any military force in history had ever moved before. The mathematics of warfare, the careful calculations of logistics and supply lines that governed modern military operations, were about to be rewritten not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by something the Germans had failed to account for in their meticulous planning: the collision of German overconfidence with American determination, and the sheer audacity of a general who treated the word impossible as a personal insult. This is the story of how that collision would determine not just the fate of one Belgian town, but the outcome of the war itself. A war documentary of World War II that reveals how 18,000 surrounded men held against overwhelming odds, while an entire army performed what military historians still regard as one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers in military history. Before we dive deeper into this incredible chapter of W2 history, if you love historical documentaries about the Second World War and want to explore more untold stories of World War II, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what city you were watching from. Now, let's journey back to understand how the Western Allies, who thought they were weeks away from final victory, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival in the frozen forests of Belgium. The transformation from confidence to crisis had begun just 6 days earlier, in the pregnant darkness of December 16th. For months, the Western Allies had been grinding steadily toward Germany's borders. Their advance slowed not by German resistance, but by the practical limitations of supply lines stretched across France. American and British commanders believed, with considerable justification, that Germany was finished, that the Wehrmacht was a broken force capable only of defensive fighting, that the war would end by Christmas or shortly thereafter. Intelligence reports confirmed this assessment. German forces were retreating on all fronts. Their industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. Fuel shortages had grounded much of the Luftwaffe. The Red Army was crushing German armies in the east. Victory seemed inevitable, a matter of logistics rather than combat. At precisely 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, that comfortable certainty exploded into chaos. The Ardennes Forest, a quiet sector held by inexperienced or recuperating American divisions, erupted with a violence not seen on the Western Front since the German blitzkrieg of 1940. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, their shells screaming through the frozen darkness toward unsuspecting American positions. The bombardment was methodical, devastating, unlike anything American troops in this sector had experienced. Trees, exploded into deadly splinters. Command posts disappeared in eruptions of earth and fire. Communication lines were severed. The very air seemed to scream with the passage of shells. Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 99th Infantry Division, huddled in a frozen foxhole as the world came apart around him, would later write words that captured the shock of that moment. The earth shook beneath us, as if God himself were pounding the ground with enormous fists. Trees exploded into splinters that flew like bullets through the darkness. The screaming of shells mixed with the screaming of men. We had been told the Germans were finished, that they had nothing left, that we were just mopping up. We had been catastrophically wrong. This bombardment, this massive expenditure of ammunition that intelligence had assured them Germany no longer possessed, announced that the war was far from over. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble. To reverse the tide of a war Germany was losing on every front. In absolute secrecy that represented one of the most successful deception operations of the war, the Wehrmacht had assembled more than 410,000 troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces in the Eifel forests east of the Ardennes. They had moved this massive force through dense forest at night, maintaining complete radio silence, using horses instead of motorized transport to avoid the engine noise that might alert Allied reconnaissance aircraft. When trucks were necessary, their engines were muffled. Troop movements were conducted during bad weather when Allied aircraft were grounded. The buildup had taken weeks of meticulous planning and execution. General Major Heinz Kocket, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, one of the assault formations tasked with breaking through American lines, recorded the moment before the attack with words that revealed both determination and desperation. The soldiers stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath freezing in clouds before their faces, despite their exertion and nervous energy. They knew what was at stake with a clarity that needed no explanation from their officers. This was not just another offensive, not simply another attempt to slow the Allied advance. This was Germany's last chance to change the course of the war, to split the Allied armies and destroy enough of their strength to force a negotiated peace. Everything depended on the next few hours, the next few days. There would be no second attempt. This was all or nothing. The strategic concept behind the offensive was ambitious to the point of delusion, yet it contained a certain twisted logic that made sense within Hitler's increasingly disconnected view of reality. German forces would punch through the weakest section of the Allied line in the Ardennes, a hilly, forested region that Allied commanders had deemed unsuitable for major offensive operations and had therefore left lightly to. The breakthrough forces would then drive west toward the Meuse River, cross it before Allied reserves could respond, and continue all the way to Antwerp, Belgium's crucial port through which most Allied supplies flowed. Capturing Antwerp would cut off and isolate the British 21st Army Group and significant portions of the American 1st and 9th Armies north of the breakthrough. With a quarter of the Allied forces in Western Europe surrounded and destroyed, with Allied supply lines disrupted, Hitler believed the Western Allies might be forced to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all remaining strength against the Soviet Union advancing from the east. The plan required speed above all else. German forces needed to reach the Meuse River, 50 miles away, within 2 days, needed to capture Antwerp within a week, needed to accomplish all this before Allied air power, grounded by winter weather, could return to dominate the skies. Every hour of delay would allow the Allies to rush reinforcements to block the advance. The entire operation hung on a thread of optimistic assumptions about weather, American response times, and German units maintaining their offensive momentum against what would surely be desperate American resistance. The target was indeed the weakest point in the Allied line, but weak is a relative term. 4 American divisions were spread across the Ardennes sector. 2 were green units, newly arrived in Europe and assigned to this quiet sector to gain experience without facing serious combat. 2 were veteran divisions recovering from brutal fighting in the Hürtgen forest, sent to the Ardennes to rest and absorb replacements. These divisions held a frontage that doctrine said should require twice their number. They were thinly spread, understrength, under-equipped for the winter weather that had arrived earlier than usual. When the German offensive struck, entire American units were overrun within hours. Others retreated in disorder, falling back through the forested hills, trying to establish new defensive lines, radioing for help that seemed impossibly distant. But the German plan contained one critical requirement that would prove to be its undoing. They needed to capture the vital road junction at Bastogne within 48 hours of the offensive's launch. 7 major roads converged at this small Belgian market town of 3,000 inhabitants, in a region of hills, forests, and limited road networks. These roads represented the only practical routes for moving the hundreds of German tanks and thousands of vehicles required for a sustained offensive. Without Bastogne's road network, German mechanized forces would be channeled into a few narrow corridors where they could be blocked. With Bastogne, the offensive could fan out, maintain momentum, achieve the breakthrough that Hitler's plan required. The town that most Americans couldn't find on a map before December 1944 was about to become the hinge on which the entire war in Western Europe would turn. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps, tasked with capturing Bastogne, and his force was formidable by any standard. The elite 2nd Panzer Division with 88 tanks and assault guns, veterans of campaigns from Poland to France to the Eastern Front. The Panzer Lehr Division, once an elite training formation, now rebuilt for combat with 57 tanks. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division with 17,000 infantry, recently reconstituted after being destroyed on the Eastern Front. These weren't the ragtag remnants that Allied intelligence had assured commanders were all Germany had left. These were well-equipped, well-led, motivated formations that believed, or at least hoped, that they were fighting for Germany's survival. Racing toward the same objective from the opposite direction was the United States 101st Airborne Division. The Screaming Eagles, paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought their way through Operation Market Garden in Holland. They had been resting at Reims in northeastern France, recovering from 72 days of brutal combat in the Netherlands, absorbing replacements, repairing equipment. When the call came on December 17th ordering them to Bastogne immediately, they had no winter clothing because the army had assumed winter uniforms wouldn't be needed until after Germany surrendered. They had insufficient ammunition, no clear intelligence about what they were driving into, no time to prepare. Just grab your weapons, climb on the trucks, and go. The trucks arrived, hundreds of them, requisitioned from supply units throughout the theater. The paratroopers loaded up and began rolling north through the night to warn an enemy force whose size and intentions remained unknown. December 17th, 900 hours in the evening, the temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees Fahrenheit as the first trucks carrying the 101st Airborne rolled through the winter darkness toward Bastogne, their headlights mere slits because of blackout regulations. Drivers navigating icy roads by instinct and luck. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment would remember the journey with vivid clarity decades later, the details etched into memory by the fear and confusion and determination of that night. We passed endless columns of American troops heading in the opposite direction, streaming south away from the German breakthrough, retreating in disorder that sometimes approached panic. Some soldiers had no weapons, having abandoned them in the chaos of the German assault. Many had no helmets, no equipment beyond what they wore. Their uniforms were torn, dirty, sometimes blood-stained. They shouted at us through the darkness as our trucks passed, their voices hoarse with exhaustion and terror. "Go back," they screamed. "Go back while you can. They'll kill you all. It's hopeless up there." One soldier, his eyes wide with something beyond fear, with the look of a man who had seen things that had broken something inside him, grabbed Birgit's arm as their truck slowed in traffic. "There's thousands of them," he said, his voice shaking. "Tigers, panthers, everything. Tanks everywhere. You can't stop them. Nobody can stop them." Budget pushed him away, not roughly, but firmly. We weren't going back. We were paratroopers. Running wasn't in our training or our temperament, but seeing those retreating soldiers, seeing the fear in their faces, made us realize we were heading into something far worse than we'd been told. The convoy stretched 4 miles through the night, 380 trucks carrying an entire division toward battle. The paratroopers huddled in the truck beds, trying to stay warm, checking weapons they couldn't see in the darkness, each man alone with his thoughts and fears. They had no detailed maps, because maps were scarce, and the situation was changing hourly. Intelligence reports were contradictory, fragmentary, often hours out of date. All the 101st knew was that they had to reach Bastogne before the Germans, had to hold it no matter what, because if Bastogne fell, the entire American position in the Ardennes might collapse. The 101st Airborne Division that rolled toward Bastogne that night had an effective strength. According to morning reports from December 18th, of 850 officers and 11,035 enlisted men, a total of 11,840 souls. This force included 4 infantry regiments organized as the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, each comprising men who had volunteered for the most dangerous duty the Army offered, plus the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, composed of men who rode into battle in flimsy gliders, towed behind aircraft. Supporting these infantry were 4 artillery battalions equipped with the small pack howitzers, designed for airborne operations, plus engineers, medics, signal troops, and all the other specialized personnel required to make a division function as a fighting force. Leading elements of the 501st Pier, racing ahead of the main convoy, reached Bastogne at 11:30 in the evening on December 18th. They had beaten the main German force by mere hours, arriving just in time to begin establishing defensive positions before German armor could seize the undefended town. Those hours would prove decisive. Already in Bastogne when the paratroopers arrived was Team Des, a combat team from the 10th Armored Division commanded by Major William D. Sabri. A mechanized task force built around a corps of Sherman tanks and armored infantry. De Sabri had been ordered north from Luxembourg and had established a roadblock at Neuville, 3 miles north of Bastogne, directly in the path of the 2nd Panzer Division's advance. At dawn on December 19th, in fog so thick that visibility dropped to 50 yards, Team de Sabri made first contact with German spearheads that emerged from the mist like mechanical ghosts, their armor clattering, engines rumbling, a sound that American tankers had learned to fear. Sergeant William McCloskey, a Sherman tank commander with Team de Sabri, described that first encounter with the enemy in words that captured both the terror and the grim determination of mechanized combat in winter conditions. The fog that morning was so thick, you literally couldn't see 50 yards in any direction. Sound became everything, our primary sense. Then we heard them approaching through that white shroud, the deep rumble of German armor. The distinctive sound of German tank engines and tracks that you learned to recognize because your life depended on knowing whether those sounds meant friends or enemies. When the first Panther tank emerged from the mist like some prehistoric predator materializing from nowhere, it looked enormous, invincible, like a monster from Nightmare. Our 75mm rounds bounced off its front armor like ping-pong balls hitting a steel wall. We had to let them get close, dangerously close. Close enough that they could kill us with a single shot, just to get firing angles on their thinner side armor. It was like fighting dragons, with slingshots. The battle for Neuville raged throughout December 19th and into December 20th. 48 hours of close-range combat in fog and snow. Team de Sabri, with just 15 Sherman tanks and a few hundred armored infantry, faced the entire 2nd Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations. The Americans fought with desperate skill, using the fog as concealment, ambushing German tanks from hidden positions, falling back from one defensive line to the next, making the Germans pay for every yard. They destroyed 31 German tanks before being ordered to withdraw into Bastogne's perimeter. Major de Sabri himself was severely wounded when a German shell hit his command post, fragments of steel and concrete nearly killing him. But Team de Sabri's sacrifice had bought something more precious than time. It had demonstrated to the Germans that Bastogne would not fall easily, that the Americans would fight for every building, every street, every yard of frozen ground. December 20th brought a new commander to Bastogne's embattled garrison. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe arrived to take temporary command of the 101st Airborne, while the division's regular commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was attending conferences in Washington and couldn't return through German-controlled territory. McAuliffe was an artillery officer by training and temperament, known throughout the Army for his unflappable calm under pressure, for his ability to assess situations without panic or overreaction. In the coming week, he would need every ounce of that composure, every bit of that steadiness, because the situation facing him was grim beyond what most commanders ever confront. The situation map in McAuliffe's makeshift headquarters, established in a Belgian barracks on the edge of town, told a story of impending disaster. German forces were closing in from 3 directions, like wolves surrounding wounded prey. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, was infiltrating through the forests from the south and east, probing for weak points in American lines. Panzerlehr was pushing from the east, its tanks grinding forward whenever fog lifted enough for armored operations. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, having bypassed Noville after Team Desabray's withdrawal, threatened from the north and northwest. By noon, on December 20th, the last road into Bastogne, the highway running southwest toward Neufchâteau, was cut by German forces. The garrison was surrounded, encircled, besieged, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, evacuation of wounded, everything that modern military forces depend on for survival. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Pier, the officer whose wartime experiences would later become famous through books and film, positioned his men in foxholes along the eastern perimeter of Bastogne's defensive line. His words captured the grim reality facing every American soldier in that shrinking pocket. We could hear German tanks moving in the darkness, just beyond our positions, their engines rumbling, tracks clattering on frozen roads. Sometimes so close we could hear German voices shouting orders. The men were digging foxholes deeper into the frozen ground, using helmets and bare hands when entrenching tools broke against earth hard as concrete from weeks of freezing temperatures. The cold was beyond anything most of us had experienced. The temperature was hovering near 0 Fahrenheit. Men's feet were already turning black from frostbite, despite every precaution. We knew that frostbite would eventually cause more casualties than German bullets. We knew we were surrounded. What we didn't know was whether anyone was coming to get us out. Inside Bastogne itself, the civilian population of approximately 3,000 Belgian men, women, and children huddled in cellars, as German artillery began systematically destroying the town, targeting the center where German intelligence correctly assumed American headquarters and supply dumps were located. Shell after shell crashed into centuries-old buildings, collapsing roofs, setting fires that burned uncontrolled because firefighting was impossible under artillery bombardment. Renée Lemire, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse working at the civilian hospital, made the decision to stay with the wounded rather than flee, treating both American and German casualties with the same skill and compassion. Her courage would cost her life before the siege ended. These Belgian civilians, caught between armies through no choice of their own, would suffer alongside the American soldiers defending their town, their homes destroyed, their lives disrupted. Some killed by shells that recognized no distinction between combatants and civilians. The defenders of Bastogne, in those final days before complete encirclement, numbered approximately 18,000 men, according to the most reliable historical counts. The 101st Airborne Division contributed its full strength of 11,840 personnel. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division under Colonel William Roberts added approximately 40 operational tanks and 2,800 men. Mechanized forces whose mobility was now trapped within the shrinking perimeter, but whose firepower remained crucial. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion brought their M18 Hellcat tank destroyers. Fast, lightly armored vehicles, mounting powerful guns. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an all-African-American unit whose service would be largely forgotten in post-war accounts despite their crucial contribution, provided artillery support. Various other artillery battalions, engineers, medics, supply troops, and headquarters personnel rounded out the garrison, 18,000 men, surrounded by 30,000 Germans, supported by hundreds of tanks, with no supplies, no reinforcements, no escape route. By every calculation of military science, they should have surrendered within days. December 21st dawned with visibility less than 100 yards. Thick fog mixed with light snow, creating a white shroud that reduced the battlefield to immediate, making movement nearly suicidal because you couldn't see enemies 50 yards away. The U.S. Army Meteorological Service report for that day described conditions as extremely adverse for any military operations, unsuitable for air support, marginal for ground movement, dangerous for exposed personnel. For the Germans, this weather represented a gift from heaven. It grounded the Allied fighter bombers that had terrorized German columns since D-Day. The previous June, the aircraft that had turned daylight movement into suicide and had destroyed hundreds of German tanks. Without Allied air superiority, the Germans believed they had a fighting chance. Oberstleutnant von Leschert, commanding elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, threatening Bastogne from the north, noted in his diary, but the weather is our ally now. Without their aircraft to dominate the skies, the Americans are just men like us, and we have more tanks, more artillery, more men. Time is on our side. But the weather was a double-edged sword that cut both sides. German tanks struggled through mud created by alternating freeze-thaw cycles that turned roads into quagmires. Fuel consumption doubled as vehicles fought through mire, burning precious gasoline that Germany's collapsing logistics system could barely replace. Supply trucks jackknifed on icy roads, blocking routes for hours. Wounded men froze to death before medical aid could reach them through the chaos of traffic-clogged roads and artillery bombardment. Winter was killing Germans as efficiently as it killed Americans. Inside Bastogne's shrinking perimeter, ammunition supplies were running dangerously low after days of constant combat. The artillery, which had been firing hundreds of rounds per day to break up German attacks, was rationed to just 10 rounds per gun per day, barely enough to respond to the most serious threats. Medical supplies had become virtually exhausted after the capture of the division's medical company on December 19th, when an entire unit of doctors, medics, and supplies was overrun by German forces. Morphine, the primary painkiller for wounded men, had to be reserved for only the most severe casualties. Men with lesser wounds received nothing but aspirin if they were lucky. Food supplies had dwindled to 1 meal per day, sometimes less, as supply officers tried to stretch remaining rations across an unknown number of days until relief arrived or surrender became inevitable. Private First Class James Sims of the 101st, interviewed decades later for an oral history project, recalled those days with words that captured the grinding misery of the siege. We were eating snow for water, because carrying canteens meant exposing yourself to sniper fire. And the water froze solid anyway. My foxhole buddy, the guy I'd trained with back in the States, had his feet frozen to his boots from standing watch through the night. When the medic finally cut the boots off him, his toes came off with the leather. He didn't even cry or scream. He was beyond feeling anything by then. Just looked at his ruined feet with this empty expression like he was looking at someone else's body. That was when I understood we might not make it out of this. 130 miles south of besieged Bastogne, at Verdun. In northeastern France, a very different scene was unfolding on December 19th. In a cold, damp French barracks, heated by a single inadequate pot-bellied stove that did little against the winter chill. Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower had called an emergency conference of his senior commanders to address the crisis in the Ardennes. The room was filled with the most powerful military leaders in the Western world. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, representing British forces, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces, and Lieutenant General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was fighting far to the south. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, whose assessments had failed to predict the German offensive, had just finished briefing them on the catastrophic situation developing in Belgium. The silence that followed his presentation was oppressive, heavy with the weight of potential disaster. Eisenhower broke that silence with words that would define the American response, that would transform crises into opportunity through sheer force of will. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster, Eisenhower declared, his voice firm, despite the gravity of the situation. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. We will not speak of defeat or setbacks. The Germans have stuck their head in a noose. Our job is to pull it tight. Patton, never one to miss an opportunity for dramatic flair, immediately grinned despite the tension. Hell, he said, let's have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off behind and chew them up completely. It was vintage Patton, aggressive to the point of recklessness, seeing every crisis as an opportunity for Eisenhower turned serious, his expression making clear this was no time for Patton's theatrical performances. Jor, he said, I need you to disengage from your current offensive in the Saar region and attack north toward The question is, how quickly can you pivot your entire army 90 degrees and drive north through winter conditions? What Patton said next stunned every officer in the room into momentary silence. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, he stated calmly, as if proposing something routine rather than something that military theory said was impossible. The room erupted in disbelief. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder actually laughed out loud, thinking Patton was joking or showing off. Moving an entire corps 90 degrees in winter conditions across 100 miles of icy roads in 48 hours was impossible by every standard of military logistics. Divisions needed days just to prepare for movement. Routes had to be reconnoitered. Supply dumps had to be repositioned. Artillery firing data had to be recalculated. Communication networks had to be reestablished. The idea of doing all this in 2 days was fantasy. Eisenhower's face flushed with anger at what he interpreted as Patton's grandstanding. "Don't be fatuous, George," he snapped. "If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready, and you'll go piecemeal into the attack. You'll be chewed up and destroyed before you can concentrate your forces. This isn't a time for empty boasting." But Patton wasn't boasting, wasn't engaging in his usual theatricals. For 3 days, his brilliant operations officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, had been warning him about the German buildup in the Ardennes, based on intelligence indicators that higher headquarters had dismissed. Patton, trusting Koch's judgment, had already prepared 3 different operational plans for precisely this contingency, had already issued preliminary orders to subordinate units, had already pre-positioned fuel dumps and ammunition supplies along potential routes north. When he said 48 hours, he meant it literally. "I'm not being fatuous, Ike," Patton replied, his voice calm and professional now, rather than theatrical. "I've already issued preliminary orders to my staff. We've been working on 3 possible axes of advance for the past 3 days. Colonel Koch will brief you on the details, if you wish. All I need from you is authorization to execute and designation of which approach you prefer." He pulled out a map already marked with routes and unit positions, spread it on the table before Eisenhower. "I'll use Milliken's 3rd Corps as the main assault force," he explained, pointing to marked positions. "The 4th Armored Division will lead the attack because they're my best armored formation. They'll be followed by the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions to secure flanks and maintain momentum. We'll attack from the Ardennes area, drive straight north through Luxembourg, punch through whatever German forces are in our path, and link up with the garrison at Bastogne." Eisenhower studied the map in silence, his anger fading as he realized Patton was serious, that this wasn't theater, but actual operational planning. The distance was staggering. The weather was abysmal. The roads were sheets of ice. But Bastogne had to be relieved before it fell and before the entire American position in the Ardennes collapsed. "When can you actually start the attack?" he asked quietly. "December 22nd morning," Patton replied without hesitation. 3 divisions, attacking north. "You have my word. Do it," Eisenhower ordered. "And George, don't let me down." As Patton left the meeting, moving with unusual speed and purpose, he called his headquarters with a prearranged code phrase that would set one of military history's most remarkable operations into motion. "Play ball," he said into the field telephone. Those 2 simple words triggered orders that had already been prepared, set in motion a choreographed dance of movement involving 250,000 men and more than 130,000 vehicles across 100 miles of winter landscape. Within hours of that code word, 133,000 vehicles began moving north along icy roads through blizzard conditions. The entire Third Army, 250,000 men organized into multiple corps and divisions, had to be completely reoriented from attacking east into Germany to attacking north into Belgium. Supply dumps that had been carefully positioned for an offensive into the Saar region had to be relocated. 20,000 miles of telephone wire had to be restrung to create new communication networks. Artillery firing positions calculated for attacking in one direction had to be completely recalculated for a different direction. It was, by any standard, logistically impossible. Patton intended to do it in under 3 days. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, an officer who would later become Army Chief of Staff, received his movement orders at 700 hours on the evening of December 19th. His tank battalion had to move 150 miles in 19 hours through a blizzard, reach assembly areas, refuel and rearm, and be ready to attack at dawn. "We drove with blackout lights through the night," Abrams later recalled in his memoir. Tank commanders stood in their open turrets despite temperatures below 0. Freezing, solid, literally freezing, guiding drivers who couldn't see the icy roads ahead. Men fell asleep standing up in their turrets from exhaustion and had to be physically shaken awake by their crews. We lost tanks to accidents, vehicles sliding off roads into ditches, but we kept moving because we knew those paratroopers at Bastogne were counting on us to get there in time. The logistics of moving an entire armored division were staggering beyond what civilians could comprehend. Each Sherman tank consumed 175 gallons of fuel just for the approach march to the start line. The 4th Armored Division needed 50,000 gallons of gasoline just to reach jumping-off positions, and that didn't include the fuel needed for the actual attack. Fuel trucks drove continuously through the night, many sliding off icy roads into ditches where they had to be abandoned. When trucks broke down, fuel was transferred by hand using 5-gallon jerry cans. Soldiers forming human chains to pass cans from vehicle to vehicle. Master Sergeant Frank Carousel of the 4th Armored Division's maintenance company worked for 72 straight hours without sleep, keeping the division's vehicles operational. We changed track blocks on tanks while they were still moving forward toward assembly areas, he recalled. Men's hands literally froze to the metal they were working on. We had multiple cases where skin came off soldiers' hands when they pulled away from frozen metal, but nobody stopped working. Nobody quit. We all understood that those paratroopers surrounded at Bastogne were depending on us to get there, and we weren't going to let them down no matter what it cost us. Back in surrounded Bastogne, as Patton's forces began their epic movement north, the situation had become increasingly desperate with each passing hour. The defensive perimeter had shrunk to less than 16 square miles, a tiny pocket of American resistance surrounded by an ocean of German forces. German artillery had zeroed in on every strong point, every crossroad, every building that might shelter American troops. Shells fell with methodical regularity, grinding down buildings, killing defenders, destroying what little cover existed. The aid stations were overflowing with wounded men lying on floors because all beds were full, their groans and screams forming a chorus of suffering that haunted everyone who heard it. Medical personnel worked without rest, performing surgery by candlelight when generators failed, amputating frozen limbs, trying to save lives with inadequate supplies and overwhelming casualties. At 11:30 in the morning on December 22nd, as German artillery continued its systematic destruction of German officers approached the American lines near the village of Remoifis under a white flag of truce, carrying a message that German commanders believed would finally end this pointless resistance. They were met by soldiers of F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, who were immediately suspicious because German attempts at infiltration using captured American uniforms had become common. The German party consisted of Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps staff, Lieutenant Helmuth Henk of the Panzer Operations Section, and 2 enlisted men from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, serving as guards and witnesses. Major Wagner carried a typed ultimatum on 2 sheets of paper, one version in English and one in German. The English version had been typed on an English-language typewriter with German diacritical marks added by hand afterward, suggesting the Germans had captured American equipment and were making use of it. The document was formal, almost legalistic in its phrasing, wrapped in the language of military courtesy that barely concealed its underlying threat. When American soldiers brought the German delegation to the command post, the message was immediately taken to General McAuliffe, who had been catching a desperately needed brief nap in the basement of the Belgian barracks, serving as division headquarters, trying to rest after 48 hours of continuous operations. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore awakened McAuliffe and said with a tone that mixed incredulity and dark humor, "The Germans have sent some people forward under a flag of truce. They're asking us to surrender." McAuliffe's immediate, instinctive response, spoken before he was fully awake, would become the most famous single word in American military history. "Not?" he said, then rolled over as if to return to sleep before the full absurdity of the situation struck him and he sat up. His staff officers gathered around as he read the full German ultimatum aloud, its pompous language becoming almost comical in the context of what the Americans had already endured. The message spoke of the hopeless position of American forces, warned that German artillery was ready to annihilate the USA troops in and around Bastogne, claimed that only surrender could save the garrison from total annihilation. Colonel Moore, trying to help his commander formulate an appropriate response to this formal demand, asked what the official reply should be. McAuliffe was genuinely puzzled about how to respond to something so presumptuous. "Well, I don't know what the hell to tell them," he said, his mind still processing the sheer audacity of Germans demanding his surrender when his men had been holding them off for days. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division's G3 operations officer, spoke up with a suggestion that would echo through history. What you said initially would be hard to beat, General. That first response, McAuliffe looked confused for a moment. What do you mean? What I said first? Kennard grinned. You said nuts, sir. The room erupted in laughter and agreement, tension breaking in that moment of shared absurdity. Officers who hadn't smiled in days were suddenly laughing. Not from joy, but from the perfect appropriateness of that single-word response to German presumption. McAuliffe sat down and penned the official response that would become legendary, keeping it as brief and dismissive as possible. To the German commander, nuts. Signed, the American commander, when Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, delivered the response to the waiting German officers who had been kept under guard at American lines. They were genuinely confused by American idiom they didn't understand. The Germans read the single word repeatedly, trying to parse its meaning. Nuts, Major Wagner said, pronouncing it carefully. What does this mean? Is this affirmative or negative? Harper, a combat veteran who had seen too much death to feel charitable toward the enemy, couldn't resist explaining in terms even Germans would understand. It means go to hell, Said flatly, and I'll tell you something else. If you continue this attack, we're going to kill every goddamn German soldier that tries to break into this city. We're not surrendering. We're not negotiating. We're going to fight until you're all dead or we are. Major Wagner stiffened with Prussian military dignity, his face flushing at the insult. We will kill many Americans, he replied coldly. This is war. On your way, Bud, Harper replied, dismissing them. And good luck to you. You're going to need it. General Airborne Manteufel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, under whose authority the surrender demand had been sent, later admitted in post-war interrogations that he had been surprised and annoyed that the ultimatum was sent at all. Panzer Lehr Division sent parliamentarians to Bastogne, demanding surrender without my authorization or knowledge. Von Manteufel stated. The demand to surrender was refused, as I could have predicted it would be. Americans are stubborn fighters, particularly when they believe they're defending an important position. The ultimatum was a waste of time and actually strengthened American morale by giving them something to rally around. The German reaction to McAuliffe's defiant response was swift and brutal, designed to demonstrate that the Americans' refusal to surrender would be punished with maximum force. That evening of December 22nd, the Luftwaffe, which had been largely absent from the skies for months due to fuel shortages and Allied air superiority, launched its first major bombing raid on Bastogne in days, taking advantage of continuing bad weather that kept Allied fighters grounded. For the defenders huddled in their foxholes along the perimeter and in ruined buildings throughout the town, it was a preview of hell delivered from above. Corporal Walter Gordon of E.C. Company, 506th Pier, described the bombing in an oral history recorded decades later. The ground shook like an earthquake, like the earth itself was trying to throw us off. Trees burst into flames, despite being covered in snow and ice. Shrapnel whizzed through the frozen air like angry hornets, making that distinctive whining sound that you never forget once you've heard it. We pressed ourselves into the frozen earth, as flat as we could get, and prayed. Actually prayed out loud, something I hadn't done since childhood. The temperature that night plummeted to near 10 degrees Fahrenheit, adding the enemy of cold to the enemies of shells and bullets. In the foxholes dug along Bastogne's perimeter, soldiers took turns sleeping to prevent freezing to death, one man staying awake to shake his foxhole companion every few minutes to ensure he hadn't slipped from sleep into the hypothermia that could kill silently. They learned through bitter experience to urinate in empty ration cans rather than leave their holes, because exposure for even a few minutes could mean death from German sniper fire, or from frostbite that could take fingers and toes. Soldiers wrapped their feet in any cloth they could find, stuffed newspaper into their boots, did everything possible to preserve their extremities against cold that was as deadly as any enemy weapon. Food had become desperately scarce, a crisis that threatened to sap the defenders' strength as surely as German attacks. The official ration had been reduced to 1 ration per man per day, providing about 2,800 calories when soldiers fighting in extreme cold needed closer to 4,000 calories just to maintain body weight and function. Men were losing weight visibly, their uniforms hanging looser each day, their faces becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. Soldiers learned to save the wax-coated cardboard boxers that rations came in because the wax burned long enough and hot enough to heat a canteen cup of snow into drinkable water. Technical Sergeant Donald Malarkey, whose wartime experiences would later be chronicled in popular histories, found a creative if unappetizing solution to the food crisis. We discovered that the dead German horses scattered around the battlefield, and there were hundreds of them killed by our artillery and left where they fell, were frozen absolutely solid like blocks of meat in a freezer. They represented fresh meat. Protein we desperately needed. We'd hack off chunks with bayonets and axes, cook them over fires made from broken ammunition boxers and furniture from destroyed houses. The horse meat tasted terrible, tough and gamey and wrong, but it kept us alive and gave us strength to keep fighting. December 23rd brought both desperate hope and renewed horror to surrounded Bastogne. The weather patterns that had cloaked the battlefield in fog for a week finally began to shift. Clouds breaking up, visibility improving, raising hopes among the defenders that aerial resupply might finally be possible. But clearing skies also enabled the Luftwaffe to launch its most devastating raid of the siege. At 8:30 in the evening on what should have been a quiet Christmas Eve, German bombers appeared over Bastogne in the largest formation yet, their engines a droning menace in the darkness. The town's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, tracers arcing into the night sky, but couldn't stop all the attackers. One German bomb, whether through skill or terrible luck, scored a direct hit on the makeshift aid station, where Renée Lemaire, the Belgian nurse who'd refused to evacuate, was working alongside American medics to care for dozens of wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved. The building collapsed instantly, trapping wounded men and medical personnel beneath tons of rubble. Corporal Kenneth Moore was outside the aid station when the bomb struck. "I heard the explosion, felt the blast wave knock me down," he recalled. "When I got up and looked, where the 3-story aid station had been just seconds before was now a pile of broken stone and shattered timber. We could hear voices underneath the rubble, men crying for help, calling for their mothers, screaming in pain. We dug with our bare hands through the night, pulling out bodies, some alive, most dead. Miss Lemaire's body was found the next morning. She had stayed with the patients who were too badly wounded to evacuate. Stayed at her post, even though she could have fled to safety. 30 American soldiers died in that one bombing, along with the Belgian nurse who had become a symbol of hope and humanity for everyone who knew her. Augusta Chiwi, a Congolese Belgian nurse, working alongside Lemaire, survived the bombing and continued treating wounded soldiers for 30 consecutive hours after the attack, working without rest despite her own injuries and shock, moving from patient to patient with whatever medical supplies could be salvaged from the ruins. Her service, like that of the African American Artillery Battalion defending the perimeter, would be largely forgotten in post-war accounts that focused on white soldiers' heroism. As Christmas Eve turned to Christmas Day in 1944, Patton's Third Army was struggling through blizzard conditions that tested human endurance and mechanical reliability to their limits. The attack that had begun on December 22nd was behind Patton's optimistic schedule, delayed by weather, German resistance, and the sheer difficulty of moving armored forces through winter conditions. The 4th Armored Division, tasked with leading the relief effort, had advanced only 7 miles in 3 days of brutal fighting. Hermann forces, recognizing that preventing relief of Bastogne was their last chance to achieve anything from the offensive, fought with desperate skill and determination to block every road, contest every village, delay the American advance by hours that might make the difference between Bastogne holding or surrender. Patton, never one for conventional solutions to military problems, had summoned his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, on December 22nd with an unusual request that mixed military necessity with religious faith. "Chaplain," Patton said without preamble, "I want you to publish a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if you can't get God to work on our side for a change." O'Neill, a man of genuine faith but also practical sense, was dubious about this mixing of military operations and divine intervention. "Sir," he replied carefully, "it's going to take a pretty thick rug for that kind of praying. Praying for good weather so we can kill our enemies more efficiently isn't exactly standard theological practice. I don't care if it takes a flying carpet." Patton shot back, "I want you to get up a prayer for good weather, and I want it published and distributed to every soldier in Third Army. That's an order." The Preonial Compost was printed on 250,000 cards and distributed throughout. Third Army in one of history's stranger combinations of faith and military operations. Almighty and most merciful Father, it read, we humbly beseech thee, of thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee that, armed with thy power, we may advance from victory to victory, and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies, and establish thy justice among men and nations. Whether through divine intervention, meteorological coincidence, or simple statistical probability. December 23rd dawned crystal clear for the first time in a week. The transformation was sudden and complete. Fog that had blanketed the battlefield for 7 days lifted like a curtain being raised. The sun broke through clouds for the first time since mid-December. Visibility suddenly stretched to 10 miles or more. Temperature rose above freezing for the first time in weeks. Most importantly for Bastogne's desperate defenders, the Allied air forces that had been grounded by weather could finally fly. At 9:50 in the morning, the first Pathfinder aircraft appeared over Bastogne, dropping colored smoke markers to designate drop zones for the massive aerial resupply operation being hastily organized at bases throughout France and England. By 11:50, the sky above Bastogne was filled with C-47 transport aircraft, 241 of them in perfect formation, the most beautiful sight that soldiers on the ground had ever witnessed. Sergeant Jack Agnew of the Pathfinder team, responsible for marking drop zones, recalled the moment with emotion still evident in his voice decades later. We popped purple smoke to mark the primary drop zone in a field east of town. Then we heard them approaching, a low rumble in the distance that grew into a roar that shook the ground. The sky literally turned dark with aircraft, hundreds of them in tight formation, the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen or ever would see. Grown men were crying at the sight. The paratroopers defending Bastogne erupted in cheers that could be heard across the battlefield. Men climbed out of foxholes despite sniper danger, waving their helmets and weapons at the aircraft overhead, many with tears streaming down their frozen faces. For 7 days they had been alone, cut off, surrounded, wondering if anyone remembered they existed or cared enough to help. Now the sky was filled with proof that they hadn't been forgotten, that the United States Army was moving heaven and earth to support them. The first parachutes blossomed at 11:55 in the morning, hundreds of them filling the sky like flowers blooming, each one carrying supplies that meant the difference between continued resistance and surrender. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, blankets, and most critically, artillery shells began raining down across the American perimeter. Of 1,446 supply bundles dropped that first day, an astonishing 95% were successfully recovered by American troops despite German artillery fire attempting to interdict the recovery operations. Captain James Parker of the 101st G4 Logistics Section, responsible for coordinating recovery of the supplies, watched men risk their lives to retrieve those bundles. Soldiers ran through active artillery fire to grab those parachutes and drag bundles to cover, he recalled. I personally witnessed a private get hit by shrapnel while dragging a supply bundle, watched him get back up bleeding from his face and chest, and continue dragging that bundle to our lines with blood streaming down his uniform. That was the kind of determination we saw that day. Everyone understood that those supplies meant survival. But the Germans hadn't been idle observers while American aircraft filled the skies above Bastogne. Anti-aircraft guns positioned in a ring around the besieged town opened fire as soon as the transport aircraft appeared, filling the sky with exploding shells and tracer fire. The C-47s, slow and vulnerable, had to fly straight and level at an altitude of just 1,000 feet to drop supplies accurately. They were, in the brutal terminology of aerial warfare, sitting ducks. Pilots held their courses through the flak. Transport crews kicked bundles out of open doors while shells exploded around them, and German gunners poured fire into the sky with desperate intensity. Several aircraft were hit. Some crashed in flames, but the airdrop continued through the afternoon. By December 26th, aerial resupply operations had delivered more than 1,000 tons of supplies by parachute and an additional 92 tons by glider. Those fragile wooden fabric aircraft that landed on improvised strips within the perimeter under fire. The biggest single airlift came on December 26th, when 289 aircraft flew what pilots called the Bastogne run, delivering everything from ammunition to medical supplies to a precious shipment of Christmas dinner for soldiers who hadn't seen hot food in a week. At 2:45 in the morning on Christmas Day, while most Americans at home were sleeping peacefully before waking to open presents, German artillery launched the heaviest barrage yet on Bastogne's perimeter, a deliberate Christmas morning attack designed to break American morale at a time when thoughts naturally turned to home and family. For 2 hours, German guns fired as rapidly as crews could load them, shells raining down on American positions in a systematic attempt to pulverize the defense into submission. Then, at 5:30, precisely timed to follow the artillery preparation, 18 Panzer Mark V Panther tanks of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, accompanied by infantry dressed in white winter camouflage that made them nearly invisible against the snow, attacked the western perimeter of the American defensive line. The assault was led by Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang Mock, whose orders from General Couchet were simple and uncompromising. Bastogne must fall today, Couchet had ordered. It is the Führer's Christmas wish. Failure is not acceptable. The German tanks broke through the first line of foxholes held by Company A of the 327th Glider Infantry, overrunning positions manned by exhausted soldiers who had been holding that line for days with minimal rest. Private First Class Kenneth Hendricks, positioned in the second defensive line, described the terror of that Christmas morning assault. The ground was shaking from the tank engines, a rumbling that you felt in your chest and stomach. In the dawn light, the Panthers looked like monsters from Nightmare, massive and unstoppable. Our bazooka teams were firing, but we could see rounds bouncing off the tank's front armor, doing no damage at all. It looked like we were finished, but the Americans had positioned their tank destroyers with careful thought about exactly this kind of breakthrough. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyers of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, fast vehicles mounting powerful 76mm guns, had been hidden in the rubble of destroyed buildings along the likely German approach routes. As the German tanks rolled past these concealed positions, focused on the American infantry ahead, the Hellcats opened fire from the flanks and rear where German armor was thinner. Sergeant Bill Harper, commanding one of the concealed Hellcats, described the ambush with grim satisfaction. We let them roll right past our position. Let all 18 Panthers get committed to the attack before we opened fire. Then we hit them from the sides and rear where their armor was thinnest. My gunner, Corporal Johnson, was absolutely incredible that morning. 5 shots in rapid succession, 3 confirmed kills, 2 more damaged. By 1000 hours on Christmas morning, all 18 German tanks were burning wrecks scattered across the snow, black smoke rising from their holes to mark where German confidence had died. Nearly 400 German soldiers lay dead or wounded in the snow around the destroyed tanks. One captured German officer, brought to headquarters for interrogation, told his American captors with obvious respect and resignation, "Your defense was magnificent. After this morning's failure, we knew we could not take Bastogne by assault. You have won." General McAuliffe, maintaining the calm demeanor that had steadied his command throughout the siege, issued a Christmas message to the troops that perfectly captured their defiant spirit. "What's merry about all this, you ask?" he wrote, acknowledging the bitter irony of Christmas in combat. "We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home. But remember, we have destroyed or stopped every element that's been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west." Allied troops are counterattacking in force. We continue to hold Bastogne. By holding Bastogne, we assure the success of the Allied armies. We are giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present, and being privileged to take part in this gallant feat of arms, we are truly making for ourselves a Merry Christmas. December 26th, 400 hours in the afternoon. Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding the lead Sherman tank of the 37th Tank Battalion, designated Cobra King, peered through his periscope at the snow-covered Belgian village of Assenois, just 4 miles south of surrounded Bastogne. For 4 brutal days, the 4th Armored Division had been fighting through determined German resistance, advancing yard by bloody yard up the narrow corridor toward Bastogne, sometimes moving only hundreds of yards per day against German forces that understood they were fighting to prevent American victory. Every village was contested. Every road was mined. Every hill concealed German anti-tank guns. The advance had been purchased with American blood and determination. The final assault toward Bastogne began at 2:20 in the afternoon on December 26th, with a massive artillery preparation designed to blast a corridor through German defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the tank battalion, ordered his forces forward while simultaneously calling for every available artillery piece to support the attack. "I want every gun you've got firing into a Sanois," he radioed to supporting artillery units. "Blast everything in that village. Give me maximum fire right now." Within minutes, 2,340 artillery rounds were falling on German positions around the Sanois, in a concentrated barrage that turned the small village into an inferno. Bulge, watching from his tank commander's position, recalled the devastating effectiveness of American artillery. "I could see German troops running from their foxholes and defensive positions as our artillery walked methodically through the village. Buildings were collapsing. Fires were starting everywhere. When the barrage finally lifted, Abrams gave the order every tanker had been waiting days to hear. Move out. Attack. We charged through that village at full speed, all guns blazing. Private James Hendricks, bow gunner, and Cobra King, described the final assault with words that captured both the violence and the exhilaration of breakthrough. We went through a Sanois like a hot knife, through butter, smashing through whatever resistance remained after the artillery preparation. Germans were shooting at us from windows, doorways, from behind walls, everywhere. Our 75mm main gun was swinging left and right constantly, firing point-blank into any building that showed resistance, destroying anything that moved. Machine guns were chattering continuously. It was chaos and violence, and the most intense 5 minutes of my entire life. At 4:50 in the afternoon, as winter darkness began to fall, Cobra King crested a small rise on the northern edge of a Sanois, and Bogus saw through his periscope what every man in his crew had been fighting to reach. American soldiers ahead, paratroopers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, the outer perimeter of Bastogne's defenses. The engineers, recognizing American tanks by their silhouettes, began cheering and waving. "Come on in," they shouted across the snow. "You're the first armor we've seen in 10 days. Welcome to Bastogne." Bogus immediately radioed Abrams with the message every soldier in 3rd Army had been waiting to hear. "Contact established with friendly forces at the siege is broken. Repeat, siege is broken." The corridor was narrow, barely 400 yards wide between German forces on either side, vulnerable to German counterattack. But it was open. Reinforcements could flow north. Wounded could be evacuated south. Supplies could reach the defenders. Bastogne had held. The news of the breakthrough spread through Bastogne's perimeter like wildfire spreading through dry grass. Men who had been conserving every round of ammunition for days fired entire magazines into the air in celebration, despite officers' attempts to restore fire discipline. Wounded soldiers in the overcrowded aid stations cheered despite their pain, some trying to stand despite injuries that made movement agonizing. Hinad al-Mukallaf, maintaining the understated calm that had characterized his command throughout the siege, simply said, when informed of the breakthrough, "We're glad to see you, boys." That was all. No speeches, no drama, just quiet acknowledgement that his command had done what they were ordered to do. Hold Bastogne, no matter what. But for the Germans surrounding Bastogne, for the commanders who had thrown division after division against the American perimeter, for the soldiers who had fought and died trying to take one small Belgian town, the psychological impact of the relief was devastating, beyond simple tactical defeat. General Major Coquet, whose 26th Volksgrenadier Division had borne much of the fighting around Bastogne, wrote in his diary with obvious despair, "The relief of Bastogne represents complete disaster, not just tactically but morally and psychologically. Our soldiers no longer believe we can win this war. They have seen American determination, witnessed American skill and courage, and it has broken something inside them. The offensive has failed. Everything we hoped to achieve is lost." Oberstleutnant Kaufmann of Panzer Lehr Division, interviewed after being captured several days later, was even more blunt in his assessment of what Bastogne meant. "We threw everything we had at that town," he told his interrogators. "Our best remaining troops, our last reserves of tanks and ammunition, our final offensive capability. And for what? They held. When we sent them an ultimatum demanding surrender. Ultimatum written in proper military language acknowledging their brave resistance. They laughed at us. Nuts. That single word did more damage to German morale than 1,000 Allied bombs. It told us that Americans would never surrender, that they would fight to the last man, that our offensive was doomed. The statistical accounting of the siege revealed both the cost of defense and the magnitude of accomplishment. The defenders had started with approximately 18,000 men on December 20th, when the encirclement was completed. By December 26th, when relief arrived, casualties had been severe but not catastrophic. The 101st Airborne Division's casualties from December 19th through January 6th, when the division was finally relieved and sent to rest areas, would total 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. Many of the missing later confirmed as killed. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division suffered approximately 500 casualties killed and wounded. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, despite being in continuous combat throughout the siege, had destroyed 108 German armored vehicles while losing only 17 of their own Hellcats, a kill ratio that testified to superior American gunnery and tactical deployment. German losses around Bastogne were catastrophic by any measure. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which had entered the battle at nearly full strength, suffered over 60% casualties, effectively ceasing to exist as a combat formation. Panzer Division lost 42 tanks that German industry could not replace. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had bypassed Bastogne to drive toward the Meuse River in what represented the deepest German penetration of the offensive, ran out of fuel just 4 miles short of the river and was systematically destroyed by the American 2nd Armored Division in a battle that eliminated the division as an effective force. December 27th brought weather that was even clearer than the previous days, and with that clarity came the full devastating might of Allied air power that had been held in check by weather for 2 weeks. From December 23rd through December 27th, Allied aircraft flew more than 34,000 sorties over the Ardennes battlefield, a sustained aerial offensive that destroyed German supply lines, shattered German armored columns, and made daylight movement suicidal for German forces. The Luftwaffe, which had started the offensive with approximately 2,000 aircraft representing Germany's last substantial air reserve, was reduced to fewer than 300 operational aircraft within 1 week of intensive combat. German air losses exceeded 75%, losses that could never be replaced. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Closterman of the Royal Air Force, flying Hawker Tempest fighter bombers from bases in France, described the aerial onslaught with words that captured both the pilot's professionalism and the terrible efficiency of modern air power. What we called tank plinking, he recalled. Hunting German armor from the air. The Germans had virtually no air cover left after the first few days. We would dive from 8,000 feet altitude, release our rockets at 2,000 feet, aiming for the thin top armor of tanks, then pull up and circle to assess damage. Below us, German vehicles burned 4 miles along every road, creating columns of black smoke that marked the death of German mobility and the end of their offensive capability. The most devastating single air raid came on December 26th, when 294 Royal Air Force Lancaster heavy bombers, aircraft normally used for strategic bombing of German cities, attacked German positions around the town of Saint-Vith, in close support of ground forces, dropping 1,140 tons of bombs in a concentrated area. The effect was catastrophic for German forces caught in the target area. Every road within 3 kilometers of Saint-Vith became impassable, cratered by bombs, blocked by destroyed vehicles, rendered useless for military movement. Unteroffizier Hans Buhr of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division, one of the few survivors of that raid, described it in testimony that captured both the physical and psychological impact. The earth erupted like volcanoes, he said. Entire buildings disintegrated, simply ceased to exist. Men vanished, vaporized by direct hits, or buried under collapsing structures. When the bombing finally ended after what felt like hours but was actually less than 30 minutes, I climbed from my shelter to find a moonscape, a cratered wasteland where a town had been. We couldn't advance. We couldn't retreat. We could only wait to die or surrender. General McAuliffe, in his after-action report submitted weeks later, specifically credited the 19th Tactical Air Command for Bastogne's successful defense. If it had not been for your splendid cooperation and the skill of your pilots, he wrote, we should never have been able to hold out against the forces arrayed against us. The aerial resupply saved us from starvation and ammunition exhaustion. The tactical air support destroyed German forces that we lacked the strength to defeat on our own. Throughout the siege and relief of Bastogne, something remarkable had been happening within the German forces. A psychological transformation that Allied intelligence wouldn't fully understand until extensive post-war interrogations revealed the extent of German demoralization. German soldiers had entered the Ardennes Offensive filled with propaganda about weak, spoiled, decadent Americans who would run at the first sign of serious combat. Americans who were good at industrial production but poor at actual fighting. Soldiers who valued comfort over courage. Nazi propaganda had spent years cultivating these images, telling German soldiers that democracy made men soft, that Americans lacked the ideological commitment and martial spirit of German soldiers fighting for the fatherland. But what German soldiers actually encountered at Bastogne and throughout the Ardennes shattered these comfortable illusions with the force of reality colliding with propaganda. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division wrote a letter to his wife on Christmas Eve 1944. The letter was found on his body after he was killed the following day. The Americans are not what we were told, he wrote. They are not soft or cowardly or weak. They fight like devils, with skill and determination that equals or exceeds our own. Yesterday, I personally witnessed a single American machine gun crew, just 2 men, hold off an entire company of our infantry for more than 3 hours, killing dozens of our soldiers before they were finally overrun and killed. These are not the weaklings our officers described. These are warriors, as dedicated and skilled as any German soldier. Major Johann Krag of Panzerlehr Division was captured on December 27th during the fighting around the relief corridor. His interrogation statement, preserved in American archives, was remarkable for its honest assessment of what Bastogne represented. You have won not because of superior numbers or better weapons, Krag told his interrogators, because in truth we had numerical superiority and our tanks were in many ways better than yours. You won because of spirit, because of determination, because your soldiers simply refused to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed inevitable by any rational military calculation. At Bastogne, we Germans learned that American soldiers are warriors. That democracy does not make men weak, but rather gives them something worth fighting for, that makes them strong. This lesson came too late for us to matter strategically, but it shattered assumptions that had guided our thinking throughout the war. While the dramatic defense of Bastogne captured headlines and would dominate post-war histories, Patton's relief operation represented something equally remarkable from a military science perspective. A revolution in operational warfare that demonstrated capabilities few theorists had imagined possible. The numbers involved remained staggering, even when examined decades later with full access to records and logistics reports. In just 72 hours, Patton's Third Army had moved 250,000 men across more than 100 miles of icy roads under blizzard conditions. They had repositioned 133,000 vehicles, everything from tanks to trucks to artillery pieces, without creating a single major traffic jam that would have paralyzed the movement. They had laid 20,000 miles of telephone wire to create new communication networks. They had established 70 new ammunition supply points forward positioned to support the attack. They had created 40 fuel dumps containing 500,000 gallons of gasoline. They had set up 20 mobile field hospitals. They had delivered 4,000 tons of ammunition to 4 war units. They had distributed 62,000 maps covering the new operational area. Colonel Oskar Koch, Patton's G2 intelligence officer who had predicted the German offensive when higher headquarters dismissed the possibility, later wrote about what Third Army accomplished in those critical 3 days. What General Patton achieved in pivoting Third Army 90 degrees and attacking north should have been literally impossible according to every staff college manual and every logistical calculation. Koch stated, "Our staff calculated it would take a minimum of 6 days just to plan such a movement, never mind executing it." But Patton had been wargaming this exact scenario for 2 weeks before it happened, preparing contingency plans that every other general dismissed as unnecessary because everyone knew the Germans were finished. When the moment came, when Eisenhower needed someone to do the impossible, Patton was ready because he had refused to accept conventional wisdom about what the enemy might do. The secret of Patton's success lay in preparation that others had mocked as paranoia, in contingency planning that seemed like wasted effort, in Patton's fundamental philosophy that commanders should always be thinking several moves ahead like chess players, unknown to most of his subordinates, and certainly unknown to other Allied commanders. Patton had been directing his staff to develop detailed plans for a 90-degree pivot north for more than 2 weeks before the German offensive began. When intelligence officers at higher headquarters dismissed warnings about German buildup in the Ardennes, Patton had told his staff to prepare anyway, to position supplies, to develop movement tables, to wargame how Third Army could rapidly shift from one axis of advance to another. The medical achievements during the Bastogne siege deserve special recognition because they represented life-saving under conditions that would defeat most medical systems. Despite losing most of their medical supplies and a significant portion of their medical personnel, on December 19th, when an entire medical company was captured by advancing German forces, the doctors and medics remaining in Bastogne saved lives at remarkable rates that testified to skill, dedication, and improvisation under impossible circumstances. Major René Bowman, chief surgeon of the 101st Airborne Division's medical detachment, performed 167 surgical operations in 10 days, many of them amputations of frozen limbs or repairs of traumatic combat wounds, often working without proper anesthetic, because morphine had to be reserved for the most critical cases. We operated by candlelight when the generators failed or we needed to conserve fuel, Bowman recalled in his post-war memoir. We used cognac and brandy requisitioned from Belgian civilians when the morphine supply was exhausted, alcohol being better than nothing for dulling pain during surgery. We sterilized instruments in boiling water heated over fires made from broken furniture. We used bed sheets torn into strips for bandages when gauze ran out. Every operation was a improvisation, battled against infection and shock and cold as much as against the wounds themselves. That any of our patients survived is testament to their toughness and will to live more than to our medical capabilities. Though we did everything humanly possible with resources available. Technical Sergeant Eugene Rowe of Easy Company, 506th Pier, the medic whose wartime service would later become famous through historical accounts, treated more than 200 wounded men during the siege, often crawling through artillery bombardments to reach casualties in exposed positions. Rowe never carried a weapon, only medical supplies, adhering to the Geneva Convention protections for medical personnel, even though German forces didn't always respect those protections. His dedication to saving lives under fire exemplified the courage of combat medics throughout the battle. The successful defense of Bastogne and Patton's relief operation carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory, rippling outward to affect the strategic situation across all of Western Europe, and ultimately influencing the war's final outcome. Hitler's Grand Offensive, Operation Watched, Humbrine conceived to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, thereby forcing a negotiated peace in the West, had been stopped cold by a combination of American determination at Bastogne and rapid Allied response that brought overwhelming force to bear against German spearheads. Field Marshal Hermann Rundstedt, overall German commander in the West and one of Germany's most respected military minds, admitted in his extensive post-war interrogation what Bastogne's defense meant strategically. Bastogne was the graveyard of the Ardennes Offensive, von Rundstedt stated, with the candor of a man who no longer had reason to dissemble. We absolutely needed that road junction by December 18th, at the latest to maintain offensive momentum. When the Americans held for an entire week, then were reinforced and supplied by air, we knew with certainty that the offensive had failed, that everything we had hoped to achieve was beyond reach. The Americans had proven they could react faster than we anticipated, fight harder than we expected, and sustain operations under conditions that should have forced surrender. The Germans had committed their entire strategic reserve to the Ardennes Offensive. 25 divisions representing virtually every formation Germany could still field in the West that wasn't already committed to defensive fighting. In 6 weeks of combat in the Ardennes, from mid-December 1944 through late January 1945, German forces suffered between 81,000 and 98,000 casualties, according to post-war analysis of German records. They lost more than 600 tanks and assault guns, armored vehicles that German industry could no longer replace at anywhere near the rate of loss. They lost over 1,000 aircraft, effectively destroying the Luftwaffe as a meaningful force. These were losses that Germany, with its industrial capacity collapsing under Allied bombing and its manpower reserves exhausted by 5 years of war on multiple fronts, could never replace. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, as the Ardennes Offensive became known from the Bulge it created in Allied lines, were also severe. Approximately 75,000 killed, wounded, or missing, with 19,000 confirmed killed. These were grievous losses that affected thousands of American families and communities. But America, with its vast industrial capacity and population, could replace these losses. By January 1945, fresh divisions were arriving from the United States at the rate of 1 per week, bringing new equipment, full-strength, eager if inexperienced soldiers. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, the offensive had exhausted Germany's last reserves of men and material. When the Soviet Union launched its massive winter offensive on January 12, 1945, driving toward Berlin from the east, Germany had no strategic reserves left to shift eastward to meet the threat. The path to Berlin lay open before the Red Army. The Battle of Bastogne created legends and heroes that endure in American military culture to this day. Stories that continue to be told to new generations of soldiers as examples of courage, determination, and the refusal to accept defeat. McAuliffe's nuts reply entered American military folklore as the perfect epitome of defiance, of American informality and directness in the face of European formality and pretension. The story has been retold in countless books, films, and military academy lectures as embodying the American fighting spirit. Patton's Relief March became a textbook case, studied in staff colleges and military academies worldwide, as an example of operational art, of what a well-trained, well-led army can accomplish when conventional wisdom says something is impossible. The 90-degree pivot of Third Army in winter conditions remains unmatched in military history for speed and scale. In December 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans from both sides returned to Bastogne for anniversary commemorations that demonstrated how former enemies can become friends when the passions of war cool. American veterans of the 101st Airborne and German veterans of the divisions that besieged the town met not as enemies, but as old men who had shared an experience that only they could truly understand, who had tested each other in the most extreme circumstances humans can face. General McAuliffe, then 87 years old and one of the few senior commanders still living, gave the keynote speech at the memorial ceremony. "We fought here not for conquest, but for freedom. Not from hatred, but from duty," McAuliffe told the assembled crowd of veterans, civilians, and dignitaries. And when the fighting was over, when victory was achieved, we helped rebuild what war had destroyed. We turned enemies into allies, former battlefields into peaceful communities. That is the difference between fighting for freedom and fighting for conquest. Former Abtmann Hans Dietmar of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, who had fought in the attacks on Bastogne's perimeter and survived, returned for the anniversary. "I came here as a would-be conqueror in 1944, he said in remarks translated for the American audience. "I return now as a friend, hoping for forgiveness for what my nation did. The Americans we fought showed us through their courage and their mercy what democracy really means. Not weakness, as our propaganda claimed, but strength rooted in human dignity and freedom." Today, the Mardison Memorial stands on a hill overlooking a star-shaped monument honoring the 76,890 American soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in the Battle of the Bulge. The monument's design, a 5-pointed star representing the 5-pointed white star that marked American military vehicles, contains inscriptions honoring not just American sacrifice, but also the Belgian civilians who suffered through the battle and the post-war alliance between former enemies. Every December 16th, at 5:30 in the morning, the exact moment when German artillery opened fire to begin the offensive 8 decades ago, church bells ring throughout Bastogne, in remembrance of those who fought and died. In the town square stands a Sherman tank from the 11th Armored Division that participated in later fighting around Bastogne, preserved as a memorial. Children play on it today, climbing over armor that once protected men in combat, touching metal that once absorbed German shells. The tank serves as both memorial and playground, a symbol of how war's legacy transforms across generations. Vincent Speranza, the paratrooper who became famous for bringing beer from a local brewery to wounded soldiers during the siege, returned many times to Bastogne before his death. The town's brewery created Airborne beer in his honor. At his final visit in 2019 at age 96, still sharp-minded and eloquent, he raised a glass with Belgian friends and said words that captured the bond between liberators and liberated. To the boys who didn't come home and never grew old, to the people of Bastogne, who never forgot us, to freedom, which we fought for and won together. The final statistics of the Bastogne operation remain staggering when compiled from unit records and historical analysis. American forces at Bastogne comprised an initial garrison of 18,000 men when encirclement was completed, including 11,840 from the 101st Airborne Division, and Combat Command B of the 10th Armored, with 40 operational tanks and 2,800 personnel. Total American casualties at Bastogne from December 19 through January 6 totaled approximately 4,500 killed, wounded, and missing. A casualty rate of 25% that testifies to the intensity of combat. German forces committed to capturing Bastogne grew from an initial force of 25,000 to 30,000 troops eventually increased, approximately 55,000 as reinforcements were fed into the battle. German casualties around Bastogne exceeded 15,000 killed, wounded, and captured. German tank losses exceeded 100 vehicles. Patton's relief force involved 250,000 men, pivoted north from the Saar region, 133,000 vehicles, moved to more than 100 miles in winter conditions. The breakthrough to Bastogne was achieved in 5 days of continuous combat through prepared German defensive positions. Supply operations supporting Bastogne delivered 1,200 tons of supplies by air operations, 961 C-47 transport sorties were flown under fire. 241 aircraft participated in the first major resupply drop on December 23rd alone. The recovery rate of airdropped supplies reached an astonishing 95% despite German artillery interdiction efforts. Weather data for the siege period documents the extreme conditions both sides endured. 168 consecutive hours of below freezing temperatures from December 19 through 25th. The lowest temperature recorded was approximately 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility from December 19 through 22nd averaged less than 100 yards due to fog and snow. Clear weather finally began on December 23rd, following Patton's weather prayer, enabling aerial operations that proved decisive. Winston Churchill, addressing the British Parliament in January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge finally concluded with complete Allied victory, offered an assessment that captured what Bastogne meant in the broader context of the war. "This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war," Churchill declared, "and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. The American soldiers proved themselves capable of the highest order of military skill and determination." Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, despite his complicated relationship with American commanders and his tendency to claim credit for Allied successes, admitted in his memoirs that the Americans at Bastogne wrote one of the finest chapters in military history. Their stand will be remembered and studied as long as military professionals honor courage and skill in battle. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Heinrich von Luttwitz, the German general whose 47th Panzer Corps had surrounded Bastogne and demanded its surrender. In 1954, von Luttwitz visited the Mardassen Memorial during a private trip to Belgium. Standing before the monument to American soldiers he had fought against, he saluted and spoke words that demonstrated how military professionalism can transcend nationalism. "They were magnificent enemies who became better friends," he said quietly. "They fought not for conquest or glory but for principle. That is why they deserved to win. That is why their victory led not to oppression but to liberation, not to revenge but to reconciliation." The German forces that had surrounded Bastogne and mocked the Americans as trapped and doomed learned profound lessons in those frozen December days of 1944. They learned that free men fighting for each other and for principles they believe in are stronger than any army fighting for conquest or ideology. They learned that determination and courage matter more than numerical superiority. They learned that when democracy is pushed to the brink of destruction, it pushes back with a force that tyranny can never match. Because free people fighting for freedom cannot be defeated by slaves fighting for tyrants. The relief of Bastogne stands as historical proof that freedom, when truly threatened, will always find its champions. In December 1944, those champions wore the Screaming Eagle patch of the 101st Airborne Division and the triangle insignia of Patton's Third Army. They were teenagers from Iowa farms and New York tenements, from Texas ranches and California factories, from every region and background that made up America's diversity. They were America at its best. Determined, resourceful, refusing to quit, even when quitting seemed like the only rational choice. On a quiet hillside outside Bastogne, preserved as a historical site, stands a foxhole maintained exactly as it appeared in December 1944. Frozen earth and all, a brass plaque beside it bears a simple inscription. Words spoken by a young paratrooper whose name has been lost to history, but whose spirit lives forever in military legend. They've got us surrounded, the poor bastards. That magnificent defiance, that refusal to accept defeat even when surrounded and outnumbered, that characteristically American combination of humor and determination in the face of death, captured the spirit of Bastogne better than any formal military report ever could. It was the spirit that held the line when the line seemed impossible to hold. It was the spirit that brought Patton's tanks roaring through snow and German resistance. It was the spirit that, when the critical moment came, when the fate of nations hung in balance, answered the German demand for surrender with a single word that echoes through history. The German mockery and confidence died in the frozen fields around buried beneath the thunder of Patton's advancing armor and the unconquerable determination of surrounded paratroopers who simply refused to quit. In its place grew first respect, then admiration, then eventually the friendship and alliance between former enemies that has characterized the post-war world. The fortress of democracy had held against tyranny's final assault. The arsenal of freedom had triumphed over fascist aggression, and in that triumph, purchased with blood and courage and determination, the future of the free world was secured. Not just for that generation, but for all generations that followed.